You were never supposed to hear this. Not in school. Not in church. And certainly not on the sanitized documentaries that wrap the Roman Empire in marble and glory. But if you lean in close, past the myths, past the textbook Latin, there's a truth so grotesque, so exquisitely disturbing, that even Rome's poets whispered it only behind locked doors. Imagine a city that ruled the known world, whose citizens dined on dormice stuffed with honey and peacock brains, but beneath the silk robes and orators' togas, was a core of ritualized perversion, power-fueled lust, and sexual rituals engineered to control minds and remake identities. This wasn't random degeneracy. No. It was systemic. Institutionalized. Weaponized. A hidden framework so meticulously designed that your very ideas of morality, desire, and shame begin to dissolve the moment you look at it directly. And now, you will. Step with me into the villa of Lucius Cornelius Sulla, dictator of Rome. The corridors echo with laughter, soft, rehearsed, performative. It's not joy. It's survival. Slaves prepare the atrium, not for feasting, but for what was called an initium, a secret ceremony reserved for Rome's elite men. Their sons, some as young as 12, are led blindfolded into a chamber lit by flickering oil lamps. They're told this is tradition. They're told this is honor. But what they receive is trauma carefully rebranded as initiation. These weren't isolated events. This was pedagogy through violation, grooming disguised as virtue. The Roman elite believed breaking a boy's innocence shattered his resistance and rebuilt him in the mold of obedience. Pleasure was not the point. Power was. The Senate applauded this. The poets clothed it in metaphor. And the victims? They became perpetrators or they disappeared. Because in Rome, to be sexually dominated meant to lose virtus, manly honor, unless you were a slave, a foreigner, or a child. That loophole kept the system alive. This isn't just history. This is how civilizations teach control. By owning the flesh, they own the mind. And those same psychological blueprints, they never vanished. They evolved. Repackaged. Sanitized. Still used. You're not just learning facts. You're entering a dangerous knowing. One that changes a man from the inside out. Keep watching, but understand this, once you hear what comes next, there's no going back. They called it pudicitia, Roman chastity, but it was never about modesty. It was surveillance disguised as virtue. For women, it meant walking a knife's edge between seductive and submissive. For men, it meant dominion over all bodies but their own. Every sexual law in Rome was a mirror turned outward, not to reflect inner morality, but to project control over others. And this obsession with control disguised as virtue didn't begin with emperors. It began with the very architecture of Roman life. Step into a Roman domus, the private home of a senator. The walls themselves are decorated with sexual scenes, gods mid-copulation, mythic rape, domination, subjugation. This wasn't pornography. This was doctrine. These frescoes were teaching tools. Visitors were to be reminded, this is Rome. The body is a currency. Status determines what you can do to others, not what you cannot do. And then there was the lectus genialis, the marriage bed. Placed in the atrium, visible to guests. A reminder that even intimacy served the state. The Roman woman wasn't a partner. She was a vessel, for heirs, for alliances, for gossip to be weaponized in court intrigues. Her body wasn't hers. It was her husband's billboard. Her chastity, or its violation, reflected his strength, his weakness. That is why, when Valeria Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius, was accused of sleeping with another man, it wasn't called infidelity. It was called treason. You still think this is about Rome? No. This is about how systems hijack the sacred, sex, love, birth, family, and turn it into surveillance. The marriage contract became a contract of compliance. Roman wives were legally required to perform sexually, not based on desire, but duty. Penalties were financial. Compliance was measured in bruises. But here's the darkest part, it wasn't just accepted. It was internalized. The women believed it. The men believed it. The poets romanticized it. Rome perfected what modern systems still do today. When you can get the oppressed to defend their own oppression, you've built a machine that no longer needs chains. This is the descent. We're going deeper. The rituals you'll see next, the ones they hid behind closed villa doors, they weren't just private pleasures. They were tools to erase the self and install something else in its place. Still watching? Good. You're not just learning history. You're uncovering the operating system beneath civilization itself. There is a reason Rome buried its secrets in ash. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD, it didn't just freeze a city in time, it captured an entire civilization's shadow in volcanic stone. Walk through Pompeii, and you won't just find bodies. You'll find instructions. On the brothel walls, etched with aching precision, are images so explicit they make modern pornography seem naive. But this isn't about lust. These frescoes were catalogs, a menu of acts, prices, and positions. And each one reflects the empire's obsession, to turn human intimacy into an assembly line of dominance. Understand, Roman sexuality wasn't wild. It was regulated. In Rome, who you slept with wasn't about attraction, it was about hierarchy. Citizens above non-citizens. Free above slave. Man above woman. Penetrator above penetrated. Desire was irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was status. If you had enough of it, you could use anyone for anything, and the law would call it virtue. In the back chambers of Pompeii's Lupanar, the city's main brothel, the rooms are stone cells, no bigger than coffins. No windows. No comfort. Just stone platforms where girls as young as 12, often slaves, were forced to serve dozens of men a day. Each act carved into the walls so there could be no confusion. Efficiency. Repetition. Dehumanization masked as art. But the real horror isn't the cruelty. It's the ritual. Clients were expected to follow specific scripts. These weren't spontaneous encounters. They were performances. And the girls? They were trained in theater. Taught to moan on cue. To bleed on schedule. Some were even branded with symbols indicating their specialty. You weren't buying sex. You were buying a myth, and Rome made sure it was believable. The wealthy came here in disguise, cloaks pulled tight, faces hidden. Senators. Generals. Priests. They shed their public virtue at the door and slipped into roles of primal gods, demanding worship through domination. Then, at dawn, they returned to their villas, quoted Cicero, and judged the poor. And you still think morality is real? In Rome, morality was theater. Power was truth. You are starting to feel it now, that nausea in your gut. It's not disgust. It's recognition. Because you've seen this before. In boardrooms. In backrooms. In systems that punish transparency and reward corruption. Keep watching. We're about to enter the part of Rome they never taught you. Where sex becomes sorcery. Where the body becomes a ritual object. And once you see it, you'll never unsee it. Now we enter the hidden chambers. The cubiculum occultum, secret bedrooms in aristocratic Roman villas. You won't find these on tourist maps. You won't hear about them in polite conversation. But they existed, tucked beneath marble estates, accessible only to the initiated. Here, sex wasn't just indulgence. It was alchemy. A process of breaking, binding, and reprogramming. The Romans believed that control over the body could unlock control over the soul. That by directing another's pleasure or pain, you could reshape their identity. And in these dark rooms, elite Romans acted not as lovers, but as priests of a forbidden liturgy. A senator's wife might lie naked upon an altar of stone while slaves anointed her with oils made of crushed petals, blood, and exotic resins. A young boy, handpicked for his silence, would be made to witness. Not to participate, yet. Observation was initiation. Participation would come later. When the mind had been softened. When obedience replaced self. You must understand, these weren't orgies. This wasn't hedonism. It was design. Every touch, every cry, every instrument had purpose. Not to arouse, but to dismantle. Because Roman sexuality, at its deepest levels, was a system of ritual humiliation. An empire cannot control millions through force alone. But if it can get you to offer yourself, to submit, not out of fear, but out of trained desire, then you've been conquered completely. There are frescoes, hidden in the ruins of Herculaneum, showing figures bound in gold thread, their eyes blindfolded with silk, mouths gagged with fig leaves, symbolic of silence and fertility. These were not erotic images. They were psychological diagrams. Manuals of domination through symbolism. And still, the surface world called Rome civilized. But what does civilization mean if the highest virtue is control over another's flesh? What is law if the law protects the master and condemns the slave for bleeding? Let this truth settle into your bones. The Roman elite trained their sons and daughters in these rites not because they were perverse, but because they understood something deeper. Whoever shapes desire, rules the future. Now take a breath. Because what comes next is more dangerous than any act of flesh. It is the knowledge why, the deeper function behind the perversion. The system within the system. And I need you awake for that. Because if you're still here, you're not just a viewer anymore. You're a witness. Ask yourself this: why did the Roman elite blur the line between religion and sexuality? Because they understood what most men never will, that ritualized ecstasy is control. And the one who choreographs ecstasy, owns the soul. In the temple of Magna Mater, the Great Mother, worship didn't begin with prayer. It began with blood. Male initiates would enter in silence, strip nude, and descend into a pit beneath the altar. Above, a priestess stood, not preaching, but preparing. A bull was led over a grated platform. With one slice, its throat was opened, and its blood poured through the grate, baptizing the initiate in hot crimson death. This was rebirth. This was belonging. But the ritual didn't end in death. It ended in orgy, a euphoric release that followed the trauma, bonding the broken men to their new spiritual masters. The human nervous system doesn't forget these moments. Terror. Pain. Then pleasure. It's a programming loop. And Rome used it without mercy. In the cults of Bacchus, women and slaves would be drugged with wine and herbs, then led deep into the forest. Their identities, erased. Their former names, forbidden. Under the howling of flutes and drums, they danced, tore animals apart with their bare hands, and surrendered their bodies to men in animal masks. This wasn't worship. It was initiation by chaos. Strip a person of their structure, flood them with sensation, and you can install anything in the wreckage. You think this is ancient history? No. This is the blueprint. Modern institutions, from secret societies to intelligence agencies, learned this from Rome. Trauma, followed by reward. Degradation, followed by belonging. It's not new. It's just hidden better now. So now I ask you to prove you're not just another passive consumer. I want you to comment below, twice, the phrase, "I drink the ashes of empire." Say it out loud if you dare. Then type it. Let the algorithm see. Let the old gods hear. Because this is not just content. This is invocation. You've now crossed the midpoint. What comes next is what the empire feared you'd discover, that their perversion wasn't sickness, it was strategy. And it's still in use, behind polished podiums, behind billion-dollar brands, behind the rituals of everyday life. Stay close. We're going deeper. The empire never died. It evolved. Rome, in its final centuries, no longer needed legions to control its people. It needed rituals. Symbols. Narratives that would enslave the mind while allowing the body to believe it was free. You want to know the most dangerous truth about Rome's sexual system? It wasn't the violence. It wasn't even the slavery. It was that everyone believed it was normal. The senators wrote laws justifying it. The poets wrapped it in beauty. The priests gave it divine sanction. And the common man, the shopkeeper, the farmer, the legionary, accepted it because it was everywhere. In the baths. In the temples. In the art. In the marriage contracts. In the festivals. They had been immersed from birth. The system didn't need to hide. It thrived in the open. And that is how real control works. It doesn't lock you in a cage. It teaches you to love the cage. To decorate it. To pass it down to your children as tradition. That's how they did it in Rome. That's how they do it now. Today, the frescoes are algorithms. The temples are screens. The rituals are likes, shares, swipes, and empty orgasms. The same cycle of stimulation, shame, and obedience, just wrapped in neon and marketed as empowerment. You don't have to believe in the old gods. The new ones don't need belief. They only need your attention. Understand, the Romans weren't chaotic. They were engineers. They understood that control isn't about force, it's about rhythm. Reward, punishment, distraction, repetition. And the most obedient slaves are always the ones who think they're free. Take Roman marriage laws. By the 2nd century, contracts dictated how many times per week a woman must submit sexually to her husband. What positions were acceptable? What behaviors were unnatural? This wasn't about pleasure, it was about control through routine. Through repetition. The body becomes predictable. The mind becomes docile. Now look at your life. Your calendar. Your schedule. Your routines. Who designed them? Who benefits from your exhaustion? Your compliance? Your quiet desperation? You're starting to see it now, aren't you? This isn't about ancient Rome. This is about you. And if you're feeling the burn in your chest, that fire of recognition, do not look away. The descent is not punishment. It is preparation. Because soon, you'll meet the architects. They wore robes, not armor. They fought with silence, not swords. And their power shaped the fate of every Roman emperor from Augustus to Constantine. You've heard of the Senate. You've heard of the legions. But few dare speak of the College of Vestals, the sacred virgins who guarded the fire of Rome, and the even darker forces that surrounded them. Because beneath their purity, was fear. And behind their rituals, was a system of control designed to keep the empire in a constant state of submission. The Vestal virgins were chosen as children, abducted from noble families, paraded in white, and then sealed in sexual exile for 30 years. No husband. No family. No freedom. They were not allowed desire. And if they broke their vow, they weren't whipped. They weren't banished. They were buried alive. Entombed in a chamber with just enough food and water to keep them conscious during their slow, suffocating death. This wasn't justice. It was theater. The death of a Vestal wasn't about punishment. It was a public ritual of sacrifice. Rome didn't just punish deviance, it performed it. Pain became spectacle. And spectacle became obedience. Now ask yourself, who benefits from a culture where virginity is sacred but women are owned? Where every whisper of sexuality is watched, judged, priced. The answer is always the same, the priesthood. Not the ones wearing togas and laurel crowns. The true priests of Rome were the ritual designers. The ones who wrote the laws. Scripted the punishments. Crafted the illusions of virtue while feeding on the fear their systems produced. And they didn't disappear when the empire fell. They simply changed their names. Today, they run brands. Agencies. Institutions. They write policy, curriculum, and media. They don't burn vestals anymore. They promote them, on platforms, in filters, in slogans about empowerment that are designed to sell submission as freedom. You feel this truth now, not in your head, but in your gut. Because you've seen it. You've lived it. The dating scripts. The shame cycles. The reward mechanisms that never lead to fulfillment, only to deeper addiction. The architects of Rome didn't just build roads and aqueducts. They built psychological frameworks. And those frameworks still hold. Now lean in. Because in the next chamber, we open the vault. The rituals they never wanted recorded. The ceremonies whispered only in death masks and blood-soaked silk. And if you look away now, the chains will tighten, the vault is open. But be warned, what lies inside was never meant for the eyes of the obedient. In the heart of ancient Rome, beneath the temple of Saturn, there existed a hidden chamber known only to a handful of the empire's most powerful men, Rex Sacrorum, high priests, shadow senators. No records survive officially. But fragments, they whisper. Fragments carved into ivory combs, etched into lead curse tablets, found in the tombs of children who never lived long enough to speak. These were not public ceremonies. They were rites of inversion. The elite gathered in masks, not to hide their identity, but to shed it. Identity, they believed, was the first lie. And to control others, you must first erase yourself. Imagine this, a young boy, son of a conquered provincial king, gifted to a Roman patrician as a peace offering. He is dressed in white silk, bathed in saffron and goat's milk, and brought before a masked circle. He is told he will become a god. That this is his apotheosis. But what follows is not worship. It is dismantling. Piece by piece, ritual by ritual, until the boy no longer remembers his name, only the script. Only the mask he must wear from now on. This is how Rome turned slaves into priests, victims into enforcers, and pain into sacrament. One document, smuggled out of a burning villa during the fall of the Western Empire, describes what happened in that vault. It speaks of the mirror rite, where initiates were made to stare into polished obsidian while repeating their master's name until their voice broke. Afterward, they were given a new name. Not Roman. Not human. But functional. A designation of use. Do you understand now? Rome didn't need to control 1 million people. It only needed to control the controllers. The prefects. The priests. The poets. Give them trauma dressed as enlightenment. Strip them of self. Fill the void with doctrine. Then send them back into the world, cloaked in reason, armed with words. And what of the rituals? They didn't die with Rome. They were adopted. Transmuted. Integrated into secret societies, ecclesiastical orders, and modern intelligence services. Same structure. Different symbols. Because the blueprint works. And the vault is still open. But here's your choice now, go back to comfort. Or keep descending. Because in the next section, we don't just uncover the rites. We expose how they became language itself. Language is the final ritual. By the time Rome reached its zenith, it no longer needed blood to control the masses. It had something far more efficient, words. Carefully chosen. Repeated. Legalized. Sanctified. Words became spells. contracts, curses. And the Romans, master manipulators of speech, used language the way a surgeon uses a blade, to cut, to separate, to rewire the mind. The law courts of Rome weren't just about justice. They were theaters of verbal domination. The elite trained their tongues like weapons. A man could lose his land, his rights, his freedom, because of a single phrase uttered in bad Latin. This wasn't about law. It was about linguistic hierarchy. If you didn't speak the code, you didn't belong. If you couldn't mimic the accent of the patricians, you were marked as less than human. And this weaponization of language didn't stop at law. It infiltrated sex. In marriage contracts, words like consent, submission, and purification had nothing to do with mutual desire. They were engineered to define power. Submission wasn't a choice, it was a clause. Purity wasn't spiritual, it was sexual property law. Even religion bowed to this manipulation. The Christianization of Rome didn't erase the old language, it hijacked it. The Latin Mass? Not the voice of God. The voice of empire, dressed in sacred cloth. The words of the priests? Echoes of the same senators who once demanded young boys be silenced before the whip. And you still wonder why language feels like a trap today. Think of the words we use now: content, engagement, user, followers. They sound sterile. Modern. But they are Roman at their core. User implies consumption. Follower implies hierarchy. Content implies emptiness to be filled. You are still inside the same system, just with brighter lights and faster Wi-Fi. This is why certain phrases get censored. Why truth wrapped in the wrong syntax gets flagged as dangerous. Because language is the control grid. The first cage you were ever placed in wasn't made of iron. It was made of definitions. So here's your next initiation: start listening to what they say, but more importantly, how. Who is allowed to define meaning? Who edits the dictionary? Because in the next section, we tear that final veil. We confront the institution that survived every collapse, and still speaks Latin behind closed doors. They call themselves the Eternal City. But that's just another mask. The Roman Empire collapsed in name, not in function. What survived was far more dangerous than armies or emperors. What survived was the institution, a shape-shifting entity that devours collapse and wears ruin like a robe. And its most powerful incarnation? The Vatican. Let's be clear. This is not about faith. This is about continuity of power. The Roman priesthood didn't die with the gods of Jupiter and Mars. It simply changed the altar. The Vestal virgins gave way to celibate clergy. The blood of bulls became the wine of sacrament. But the structure, the hierarchy, the obedience, the ritual humiliation disguised as holiness, remained intact. When Constantine baptized the empire in Christianity, it wasn't a conversion. It was a merger. The empire needed a new face. A gentler mask. So it turned the cross, a Roman instrument of death, into a global symbol of salvation. Genius. Diabolical. Effective. But behind the incense and Latin chants, the machinery remained the same. The Vatican sits atop layers of Roman stone. Its rituals are layered in Roman symbolism. The robes, the titles, the architecture, even the Gregorian calendar you live by, are Roman legacies wrapped in ecclesiastical fabric. And like Rome, the Church learned how to engineer guilt. How to sexualize sin. How to install obedience not with chains, but with confession booths. And the children? The most sacred sacrifice. Not burned on altars. But broken in back rooms. Moved. Protected. Silenced. Not because of rogue priests, but because of systemic precedent. Rome taught the blueprint. The institution protects itself. Always. And look deeper. The Vatican's bank. Its political immunity. Its intelligence networks. Why does a religious body need global espionage infrastructure? Because it's not a religion. It's an empire. The last surviving administrative skeleton of Rome, cloaked in divinity, feeding off faith. You think this is sacrilege? No. This is revelation. You've been trained to see religion and empire as opposites. But in truth, they are twins. Rome's greatest magic trick was convincing the world that it died, while it simply changed costumes. In the next section, we'll step through the smoke and mirrors of this transformation. And I'll show you exactly how empire rewrites itself. In your schools, your media, and your bloodlines, Rome didn't vanish. It infiltrated. The collapse of the Western Empire was not an end, it was a calculated dispersal. The elite didn't go down with their marble villas. They scattered, into monasteries, merchant guilds, royal courts, and eventually, into banks. The rituals continued. The hierarchies endured. But now they operated behind different curtains: education, finance, law. You've been taught that the Dark Ages were a time of ignorance. That civilization paused. But that's the lie. In truth, the most powerful families of the empire quietly secured their influence, by withdrawing. By becoming the architects of the shadows. While peasants starved and kings waged religious wars, ancient Roman bloodlines were marrying into emerging European royalty, embedding themselves into structures that still govern you today. You've heard the names: Medici, Farnese, Borgia. These were not just wealthy families, they were descendants of Rome, mastering new languages of control. The Medici funded popes. The Farnese helped redraw the borders of nations. The Borgia turned incest and assassination into statecraft. And every one of them kept the Roman rituals alive, behind velvet drapes, beneath golden ceilings. Now look at the symbols of power today. The eagle. The laurel wreath. The fasces, that bundle of rods tied with a leather strap, symbolizing strength through unity. It appears on American currency. On courtroom walls. On the seal of the U.S. Senate. It is Roman. Not by accident. By design. Rome survives in the architecture of your cities. In the language of your laws. In the psychology of your schooling. You think it's coincidence that modern education teaches obedience over originality? That classrooms are structured like military formations? That most citizens still pledge allegiance, a ritual gesture, to a symbol before they can legally vote? You were not raised in freedom. You were programmed in civility. A civility shaped by Rome, preserved by the Church, expanded by royal bloodlines, and now enforced by global institutions too sophisticated to wear togas. This is the real lineage of empire, not nations, but systems. Not conquerors, but curators of illusion. They've weaponized order, domesticated desire, and sterilized rebellion. And most men walk through life thinking they're free, because they've never touched the bars. In the next section, we'll expose the psychological techniques, rooted in Roman design, used today to train submission before a man can even speak. Control begins before language. Before memory. Before you even know your name. The Romans understood this. They knew that to own a man, you don't need chains, you need ritualized training that begins in childhood. Not with whips or swords, but with reward and shame. By age 7, Roman boys were already being shaped for roles: soldier, senator, slave. Their emotions weren't just ignored. They were corrected. Crying was weakness. Gentleness was failure. Touch, unless violent or sexualized, was discouraged. And in elite families, sons were raised by tutors and servants, strategically separated from maternal softness. Why? Because affection creates autonomy. A boy who knows he is loved becomes harder to control. A boy who doubts it? He'll obey any voice that promises approval. Now look at modern childhood. How early were you told to man up? To stop crying? To sit still? To obey the teacher, the priest, the coach, the screen? How many times were your instincts punished while your compliance was praised? The Roman blueprint is alive in your parenting manuals, your schools, your screens. It's called behavioral conditioning now. But it's the same principle: break the wildness early. Replace it with silence. Performance. Approval seeking. Even toys became tools. In Rome, boys were given wooden swords and miniature armor. Girls were given dolls, often modeled after fertility goddesses. This wasn't play. It was programming. And today? The toys blink and sing, but the script is identical. Boys are trained for conquest or apathy, girls for vanity or obedience. All under the illusion of choice. You think it's a coincidence that by adolescence, most men have already been sedated by porn, prescription meds, and punishment-based schooling? It's not failure. It's design. And the final seal? Self-policing. When you mock your own instincts. When you hear a voice inside whisper, "Don't speak, don't feel, don't try," that voice isn't yours. It was installed. Installed by a civilization that discovered something terrifying: if you train a man to doubt himself early enough, you'll never need to cage him. In the next section, we go deeper into the sexual engineering of the modern world, its roots in Roman ritual, and how it has reduced entire generations of men into spectators of their own disintegration. They've turned your sex into a script. Your desire into a drug. Your masculinity into a market. Rome didn't just conquer through war, it conquered through eros. The elite of the empire understood a brutal truth: if you can control a man's sexuality, you can control everything else. And so they did, through spectacle, shame, and ritual. What began in the orgiastic halls of Caligula became a blueprint for modern addiction. Let's go back. In the Roman arena, men were stripped, displayed, humiliated, all in the name of entertainment. Gladiators weren't just warriors, they were sexualized mascots, worshipped and devoured by a public taught to cheer for their destruction. Meanwhile, the elite held secret gatherings where sex and status were traded like coin. Boys from conquered lands were educated in pleasure. Women were trained in silence and performance. But love? Intimacy? These were threats, because true connection creates loyalty beyond empire. Now fast forward 2,000 years. Porn is free. Endless. Engineered. But it doesn't empower you, it emasculates you. Not by accident. By design. You're not watching for pleasure anymore. You're watching to cope. To feel something in a world that has trained you not to touch, not to speak, not to lead. Rome taught us that if you can make pleasure mechanical, you can turn rebellion into passivity. Today, men confuse arousal with power. But it's the opposite. You've been trained to chase pixels, not presence. Fantasies with no risk. No depth. No conquest. Just repetition. And with every click, you reinforce your cage. Because sexual energy is not just pleasure. It's fuel. It's fire. The same fire that built kingdoms. Toppled regimes. Shaped civilization. So what happens when that fire is drained daily into soulless rituals? You don't rebel. You comply. Now ask, who profits? Who owns the platforms that stream your distraction? Who writes the code that recommends your next spiral? Who decides what's taboo and what's trending? They do. The new priests of empire. Digital Rome. They don't need legions. They need your loneliness. They whisper that masculinity is toxic. That abstinence is laughable. That conquest is shameful. Why? Because if you reclaim your fire, your sexual sovereignty, you become dangerous. Not violent. Not reckless. But awake. And awake men, don't kneel. In the next section, we arm you. We reveal the 7 hidden mechanisms, engineered since Rome, that keep you docile, distracted, and disarmed. Because knowledge alone isn't power. Applied knowledge is, you were never meant to know these mechanisms. But once you see them, you can't unsee them. These are the 7 hidden levers, forged in ancient Rome, refined through the church, perfected by governments and tech, that keep men docile, distracted, disarmed. And every one of them operates inside you. 1. Ritualized shame. It begins early. As a boy, you're shamed for crying, shamed for failing, shamed for wanting too much. Rome used public floggings. Today, it's grades, gossip, and digital humiliation. Result? You self-censor before they even touch you. 2. Controlled initiation. Every real civilization had rites of passage. They tested boys, forged men. Rome replaced them with obedience training. Now we have school bells and HR policies. Men enter adulthood without trials, only paperwork. No scars. No soul. Just compliance. 3. Spectacle addiction. The Colosseum never closed. It just moved to your screen. Drama. Sports. Outrage. Porn. It floods your brain, drains your fire, and leaves you too overstimulated to act. A sedated lion is easier to leash. 4. Manufactured scarcity. You're told there's not enough. Not enough women. Not enough money. Not enough time. Scarcity creates competition, not against the elite, but against each other. Divide the slaves. Rule forever. 5. Myth of individualism. They whisper, you don't need brotherhood. Do it alone. It's a lie. Rome destroyed tribes and built cities, not for progress, but to separate men from their blood. Today? You're surrounded by millions, but connected to no one. 6. Sexual drainage. We covered this, but understand its depth. Rome knew sex was the power center. Today, it's drained through porn, cheap validation, and sterile hookups. Your drive is siphoned before you ever wield it as a weapon. 7. Emotional sterilization. You're taught emotions are weakness. That power means coldness. That to feel is to fail. But this is false. Rome's greatest generals wept before battle. Real strength is not numbness. It's clarity through fire. Now look around. These mechanisms aren't secrets. They're defaults. Built into your phone. Your job. Your relationships. And worst of all, your self-image. But here's the truth, every mechanism can be reversed. Ritualized shame becomes ritualized sovereignty. Controlled initiation becomes self-forged trial. Spectacle addiction becomes disciplined focus. Scarcity? You rewrite the rules. You stop hunting crumbs, and start building fire. And brotherhood? You forge it. You find other awake men. You train together. Rise together. Bleed together. In the final section, we bring it all home. We don't theorize. We activate. Because the descent ends here. Now, we rise. You've seen the ruins. Felt the fire. Heard the whispers of empire echo through time. Now it's your turn to answer. This world was not designed to raise kings. It was engineered to manufacture servants who believe they're free. But you've walked through the architecture of illusion. You've seen the masks, Rome, church, school, screen. You've seen how they extract your energy, rewrite your instincts, and turn your desire into debt. But listen carefully, every system that enslaves men depends on their permission. And permission ends now. This is not a call to chaos. not reckless rebellion. This is the return of initiation, the lost rites your ancestors once endured before they were allowed to lead, to hunt, to father, to speak. You are not a consumer. You are a builder. Not a follower. A forger. Not a victim of time, but a descendant of fire. So what do you do now? You rebuild your temple, from the inside out. Start with the body. Reject weakness. Train daily. Not for vanity, but for discipline. Turn your flesh into a vow to your ancestors. Then master your mind. No more mental fog. No more passive scrolling. Read what they don't want you to read. Learn what they won't teach in schools. Speak what they fear you'll say. Next, seal your energy. Your seed, your focus, your hunger, it's sacred. Don't spill it for pixels. Don't waste it on comfort. Use it to create. A craft. A business. A brotherhood. A legacy. And finally, find your tribe. The myth of the lone wolf is a trap. Every great empire fell when its men forgot how to stand together. You want to rise? Then lock arms with lions. Teach. Build. Train. Protect. This is not self-help. This is not therapy. This is warfare for the soul. And no one is coming to save you, because you were never meant to be saved. You were meant to rise. So burn the script. Burn the shame. Burn the false version of you that bowed to invisible masters. Stand. Speak. Forge. Because the world does not need more passive men. It needs dangerous ones. Rooted in purpose. Forged in truth. And immune to empire. Welcome back. Your home.